Okay, I think we've got about enough people to get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Jim Porter, the Director of Business Development for World Trade Center Utah, and it's my pleasure today to be able to kick us off. For those of you who are new to World Trade Center Utah and these events, uh, World Trade Center Utah is a public-private partnership here in the state that accelerates growth for Utah companies through our programs, networks, and services. We are putting on this webinar today in partnership with the Salt Lake Chamber, longstanding and special partner. Thank you to Derek and the team over there for helping us to organize this event. We're excited today to have Dr. Jeremy Petronka here to talk about cultural intelligence. I'd like to take a minute to introduce him. Dr. Petronka is the associate dean of the Master of Quantitative Management at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University, and is an associate professor of the practice in the economics area. Dr. Petronka teaches multiple disciplines, including managerial economics, strategy, cross-cultural leadership, and entrepreneurship. He's won multiple teaching awards, including the Poets and Quants Best 40 Under 40 Professors, the Fuqua MBA Awards for Excellence in Core Teaching, and the University of North Carolina Student Undergraduate Teaching and Staff Award. Prior to his career in academia, Jeremy worked as a management consultant, working with Fortune 100 companies to align their information technology with their business strategies. He focused heavily on the role of data within organizations, especially as it relates to larger strategic goals, and today will be our featured speaker and guest. Dr. Petronka, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you. Let me turn the time over to you, and we'll be, we're excited to hear what you have to say. But I'm actually going to say one more thing before I turn it over to you, which is one housekeeping item. As you have questions, please utilize the chat function there at the bottom of your screen to suggest questions to Dr. Petronka. He will, through the course of his presentation, take time to ask you for your responses and also to answer questions. So please be open and free with your questions and comments, and we'll get to them as we have time. Dr. Petronka.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I have to admit, the 40 Under 40 award, it's been a while since I was eligible for that particular one. Anyway, what we're going to talk about today, I know the tagline says negotiating like a global leader. Realistically, negotiation is just a very small part of some of the communication pieces we're going to talk about today. And I want to kind of paint the picture of what it is we're doing with a story. So, it's about probably 5 years ago. I was teaching a normal MBA class. This was in our Global Executive MBA program. So these are the students that really had a much more diverse representation from all over the world, because this is the program that actually met throughout the world and had their actual residencies in all sorts of different countries. So we had a really large cultural background, and I was teaching the long form of what I'm going to talk about today. So think about the 6-week version of what I'm going to do in 55 minutes. And as I was teaching, what I noticed in the back of the room, there was an American man who, as I kept teaching, it kept looking more and more like he was getting electrocuted. That just slowly his face just started, his eyes got bigger and bigger. He looked, I don't know if he was thinking, I don't know if he was worried. And it actually got to the point that after about 15 minutes of this happening, I had to ask him if everything was okay. And so he kind of stopped and put his thoughts together. And what he said was, so look, I've been married now for a while to someone from a very different cultural background. Are you telling me that when she says this, she really has been meaning that? And at the moment he asked that, every person from his wife's cultural background laughed harder than I've ever seen them laugh in class before. And their heads just started nodding just beyond anything I'd seen before. And at the time I was feeling kind of proud that we had that aha moment, but then even more proud was a year later, he and his wife bumped into me at an event, and she walked up to me and thanked me for his new appreciation of what she was actually attempting to communicate. That is, to this day, the high water mark of my teaching career, but it really starts painting the picture of what it is we're going to talk about today, and what some of these cultural issues are and where they actually come from. Okay, so to do that, I actually need to take a little bit of a detour before I can start giving you very concrete advice, very concrete known differences between cultures. I need to start and help you understand what is actually happening when we have these cultural conflicts that happen that are not intended to happen, and why operating in different countries can feel like such a challenge, can feel exhausting. It can also feel like you never really get your feet under you until you've been there for a few years. So to do that, the first thing I have to do is explain to you how the brain works at a very high level. So I want to do this by first asking you a question. And I'm going to ask you the question, then I'm going to basically ask you in the chat window to just say yes or no, whatever your gut immediately says. Don't overthink this. So here's the scenario. Assume a village elder legally agrees to sell communal land to an entrepreneur. Okay, 3 months though after signing the contract, the village discovers that the communal land has significant natural gas reserves of which they were unaware when signing the contract. This discovery increases the value of the land by a factor of 100. So the question to you, just answer with your gut, don't overthink it, is it ethical for the developer to hold the village to the contract? So if you wouldn't mind just throwing in the chat window, yes or no, I would love to see your responses. Okay, so what you might notice is that we have almost a 50-50 split. I have asked this question to undergrads. I've asked this question to MBAs. I've asked these questions to executives. I've now asked this question to members of the World Trade Center Utah. Every time I'll split it 50-50. And here's the thing. We could sit in a room and we could talk about this for days. It's not really going to change much because what we're looking at isn't difficult. A great definition of true ethical dilemmas I've heard is it's not good versus bad, it's good versus good. That's when the ethics are hard. And in this case, on one hand, property rights are good. Legal contracts are good. They're what actually let us develop and how to reduce uncertainty and help with commerce. So everyone knows that that's a good thing. But on the other hand, having one side that inherently has this huge information asymmetry and just went into a contract maybe uninformed, well, that's not good. But actually treating that fairly is the good thing. Both of those are right. No one's going to argue about that. So the question is, but where do you get this gut feeling then? And the answer really is, it's not a frontal cortex thing. We could sit down and very quickly dismantle what all the factors are going into this, and it's not going to change that other thing. It's that other thing that's the core of so many cultural conflicts we have, especially in the business scenario when we're trying to get the frontal cortex to work. I'm going to tell you more about that in a second. But let me take them. And by the way, what I didn't ask you is which one of these did you think was the village elder and which one of these did you think was the entrepreneur? Because that is a question for another day on which one you immediately went towards. That said, though, let me now make this a little bit more directly towards business conversation. So imagine this. Somehow I have become your boss. Congratulations. Now, you walk into my office and I am doing my best to give you my stern face. So this is the best picture I could find with me actually looking upset. I say, please sit down. So you sit down, I look at you directly, and I say, you are totally unprofessional when dealing with clients, and it's entirely undermined their respect for you. Now, I am not any of your bosses. The fact is, even through Zoom, even knowing that you're in this environment, by looking directly at you and by using these words, I will have caused at least some of you to have an anxiety response. I will have made some of you start feeling uncomfortable just hearing those words in an environment that you know I'm not your boss. Let me now change two things. First thing I want to change is look towards the right where you see me, and let me go to my normal face, which is fairly friendly. And then the second one is I want to change my language from you're totally unprofessional when dealing with clients to you can be slightly unprofessional when dealing with clients. So imagine you walk in and I say, hey, I want to talk to you. I just want you to know that it looks like you can be slightly unprofessional when dealing with clients. I think this might be undermining their respect for you. I just gave you the exact same information. I just said, in terms of the information you needed to understand, the same thing identically. But the words that I use can cause two different effects with two different people that I potentially did not intend. And the reason has everything to do with how our brains are actually constructed. It's a common, I don't know if belief is the right word, but most people think of their brain as a brain. This is my brain, but it actually is a much more reasonable kind of way to think about the brain is thinking about as us having two brains. Effectively, our lizard brain, like that animal brain that we've had for a long time, and the frontal cortex, which is more the thing that kind of makes us human. Now, what the limbic system is, this is that lizard brain. It's very deep in your system. This is the thing that's all about flight, fight, freeze, emotion. This is the emotion piece. And the thing about the limbic system is that it is designed to be very fast and, well, not, how it exists, to be fast and also to work in symbolic language. So if, for instance, you see a tiger or someone with a weapon or a clown, you quickly have these emotional responses. And the reason is you don't want to wait to have the response. So what symbolic language means is effectively your limbic system is abusing the terminology a bit, but looking for things that are analogous to things that are dangerous. So if you think about people that suffer from PTSD, this symbol, this analogy can be really far from the actual truth, but it's just close enough to get the full trigger. And when you're talking about limbic system, there is no real shades of this. It's once it fires, it fires. And so if this thing is close enough to that thing, you get the full effect. So the limbic system is fast, it operates first, and it operates in the system where it's not really nuanced, it's just there or not. Now that's in contrast to the frontal cortex. And the frontal cortex is basically the thing that makes humans smart. This developed later in our evolutionary cycle. This develops later in our actual growth cycle as humans in terms of when it actually develops. And this is the thing that's involved with decision-making, problem solving, impulse control, planning. When you are thinking about going into negotiations, when you are thinking about how to lead your new organization, when you are thinking about what contracts to enter into, this is the thing you need to be firing. Now, this is the thing that lets us do chemistry and strategy and accounting and analytics. This is that thing. The issue is, though, these two things interact. And it's the interaction that ultimately is going to be the key to this cultural communication difference. And in particular, the main way it interacts, and the first way it interacts, is that when the limbic system is engaged, it actually reduces the ability of the frontal cortex to process. And this has been shown over and over, even in political environments. And some neat studies where they did fMRI testing, they'll take someone with a known political view, show them quotes that their political candidate of choice said that are basically opposite of each other. And instead of the frontal cortex hitting, the emotional response kicks in and this shuts down. Now that said, almost everyone knows what it feels like to have your limbic system hijack your brain and your frontal cortex stop. If any of you have ever suffered from test anxiety, if any of you have gone into that environment, taken the test, and basically left and said, I think a different human just took that test. If you've looked at it the next day and said, I have no idea how my brain got to that, the reason is a different brain was actually operating. If any of you have anxiety from public speaking or from social anxiety, and you go to public speak and you start disassociating, or you just don't, the words aren't coming in correct because your limbic system is running, not your actual frontal cortex. And the reason this is happening is that this is the evolutionary advantage. You need the limbic system to be the gatekeeper into higher level thinking because higher level thinking is slow. And if you're talking about a situation where flight, fight, or freeze are the things that you need to have in play, then you need to react first. If a tiger is coming down the street, what you don't want to do is go, let me think about that tiger for a little while. That's a great way to make sure your genetics don't get passed on to the next generation. Instead, what you do is you need to react first. You need to run first, and then, or you need to fight first, or you need to hide first. Then later on, you can actually process it. So this is the first way of recognizing anything that hits that limbic system is immediately going to be shutting down the frontal cortex. But the flip side of that is that your frontal cortex can actually reduce the emotional response. For instance, if I told you that I'm about to put you in a room with a tiger and a man with a weapon and a clown, and you actually stopped and thought and went, wait a minute, I bet I'm going to a circus. As you are thinking, as that process is happening, you are actually reducing the emotional response that's happening. So one thing that I found on my own journey with anxiety during my life was the realization that I was not anxious because I was working because I was anxious. That anytime I'm anxious, as long as I just start working, the anxiety starts slowing down, or how I sometimes phrase it, the squirrels stop running around in my head. Is if I can get this thing engaged, then it'll actually calm down. It'll basically hijack the limbic system. And so that effectively means, as we start looking at this, is anytime, and these are some of the tools we're going to give you today, anytime that you can go into a cultural situation, have these frictions bumping up into each other, to the degree that you can go, wait a minute, what's happening? Why is it happening? What might they be trying to tell me? And you can get curious instead of furious. It'll actually reduce that emotional piece. And that emotional piece is the thing that makes it so difficult when you're actually interacting between different cultures, because all the cultural cues are different. It basically just feels like you're getting buffeted from all sides by all these different cues that you're not used to, you don't know how to process, and oftentimes they are anxiety inducing. So the reason this is so hard, and the reason that we have these cultural differences, is that the whole name in the game with communication is to get what is in my brain into your brain. Unfortunately, we don't have a matrix type way to connect up. There's really only one way to do that. I have to go through my words. So we have to go through this imperfect translation device to ultimately get it into your head. The problem is, if for me, these words were fully frontal cortex, is look, how I was raised, these words just mean this. But for you, those exact same words actually had the limbic response. Then I have suddenly completely put us in a spot where all we're getting is the emotional reaction, and I never intended it to happen. And the reason that we have these different ones is when these responses are built, and why they are so persistent. They are built effectively from parent to child during your developmental years. As you have this process of repetition, of knowing what causes what, your body and your limbic system basically develops these tripwires and these triggers of knowing what to look out for. To give you a true but also kind of weird example, I'm actually uncomfortable when people call me Jeremy, which is strange. One, because it's my name. Two, because when I meet new people, I tend to say, I'm Jeremy, just by default. But the fact is, in my house, when a parent called me by my name, especially by my full name, I was in a lot of trouble and things were about to get bad. And so it became the point that anytime I hear someone call me Jeremy, I actually get a physical response. I teach this. I know it happens. It still does not change. It still happens. That's why most people I have just call me Jay, because that response does not go away. Once you have these responses built up, they can be overcome with time. Things like exposure therapy, whether formal or informally. For any of you that have taken a job in another country, you know that especially the farther away culturally it is from you, the longer you're there, the more you begin to start acclimating to the new cultural cues, which interestingly means when you go back home, you are now less comfortable than you were when you left. That said, the issue we have is not everyone faces the same cultural cues. Different things mean different things. Same words can mean very different outcomes depending on the culture you live in. Is it say what you mean and mean what you say? Or is it the loudest duck gets shot? That's going to have a fundamental difference on things like, are you comfortable speaking up when you disagree with something? Okay, and so the issue we ultimately have, and where this is coming from, is our brains now have these two different mechanisms running into place. I have to go through words to get there. And unfortunately, if we have different cultural conditioning, then I could accidentally be triggering you in a way that I never intended to. And you could be getting triggered throughout a negotiation when they never intended to. So what I want to do today is start giving you some of the tools to start saying these are the things to be looking for. There are known ways that these systemically happen, and these different systemically happen. We see them at the country level, and I should be careful, even though these are all at the country level, they're really obviously the individual level, depending on how you were raised and what experiences you had, and then what your life experiences are. You can absolutely have people from the same country have very different cultural dimensions that we're going to talk about. But we're going to talk about two today. One that's really easy, and the second one is the one that Americans are so unbelievably bad at. And you'll see why when we get into it. So, by the way, there's a few places in here that I will have natural stop points to say, do you have any questions? That said, if you do have any, feel free to throw them in the chat window. I am checking that as it comes up. And I'm more than happy to dig into it. But for now, we basically set the stage. We understand how the brain works, software of the mind. Let's start getting into the two ones we're going to have time to talk to today. All right, so first one is the easy one. Different cultures disagree in fundamentally different ways. So before I do, I am, for many reasons, need to make sure that I properly cite my sources. So if you are interested in what I'm talking about today, there's two books you might be interested in. One in particular I highly recommend. The Culture Map, you're going to see that I lifted a lot from these, loosely defined. The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer is a great book, very general audience focus. So I think that's going to be the one that most of you are going to be interested in if you want the additional dimensions that we just don't have time to talk about today. If you want a bit more of the science underneath it, then the original kind of researchers who did this was Geert Hofstede in his Cultures and Organizations book. So just want to make sure that I give credit where it's due, especially to Geert Hofstede for a lot of the research, and then Aaron Meyer for really kind of seeing what this can mean in this environment. All right, so let's start talking about disagreeing. You don't need to put this in the chat window. This is just for your own reflection. And the question is this: when you hear "I disagree," do you hear "I disagree with you as a person," or do you hear "I disagree with the idea you're presenting"? And I can tell you, for me, when I hear someone say "I disagree" to me, I hear "I disagree with you." I feel that you are a fraud, that you don't know what you're talking about. And that's, again, stems from upbringing and kind of what I went through in my first 18, 20 years. Where other people, I've asked the same question, it's like, no, they just disagree with the idea, it doesn't hurt at all. This is the first dimension. We see fundamental differences at country levels and cultural levels between the two. And I think you can already see, just in terms of disagreeing, say within a negotiation, how that can cause drastically different interpretations of what's happening. So in confrontational cultures, disagreement and debate are positive for the team or organization. Open confrontation is appropriate and will not negatively impact a relationship. There's a substantive difference between a person and her idea. If you've ever been to, and you'll see some of the countries that are highly confrontational, but families that they all just seem to yell at each other all the time, but also love each other. Like, they'll yell and scream and holler and call each other names and then hug and have dinner. And it's like nothing happened. And the reason is, in that family, saying very direct words, "You are wrong, that makes no sense," was never said with the emotional heft to it. It's just like, no, that's just how you get to truth. You just go through that process. Where in non-confrontational cultures, it is very different. Disagreement and debate are negative for the team and the organization. Open confrontation is inappropriate and will break group harmony or negatively impact the relationship. There is no substantive difference between a person and her idea. In non-confrontational cultures, you just say that is wrong, you are basically hitting their limbic system and attacking them as a human. This is easy, I say, compared to the second one, because it's such an obvious, oh, I say that or that. So let's actually look at some of the differences between countries and then give some guidance on how we can handle even this first one. So a score of 100 is going to be the most confrontational. The score, 0 is the most confrontational, 100 avoids confrontation. So I will give you just a second to peruse this, and if there's anything interesting you see, then you can peruse it more. So most of these shouldn't be a huge surprise to you, but even with that, there's still some aha things that have come out to me. So there was a strange thing that I noticed with my Russian students. So my whole life, it's always been the case, for whatever reason, maybe because my last name almost sounds Russian, Petrenka's got that almost sound to it. I've gotten along amazingly, just like immediately I feel kinship with Russian folks that I've met over the years. And I've noticed it before. There's been this, just we seem to connect. And yet, when I teach, the exact opposite seemed to be happening. I actually remember I talked to my wife probably about 8 years ago. And I said, honey, like, I don't understand this, but my Russian students don't seem to like me or respect me. And I don't know why. Like, I can't figure out how to meet them where they are. I think they just don't like me. And so while I was preparing this back in the day, and I was kind of looking at the levels, and I saw Russia, it hit me, that same bolt that it hit my student before, that it made me realize, oh my God, that's what's happening. They're in class and they basically start with, you're wrong, which for me, from my upbringing, I am hearing is, I don't respect you, you are a fraud, you don't belong to be there. And I needed to translate it as into my language, oh, I respectfully disagree with you. I'm not quite sure where that's coming from, but because they just have a more direct piece. So someone said, I would say areas like the US, the differences would show up regionally due to the melting pot of its culture, right? Correct. Some regions would be more confrontational than others. That is absolutely correct. A fun example I like to give is imagine someone from the Jersey Shore gets put into a party in the deep South. Imagine they're all speaking English and yet somehow they're not. And the first time someone says, oh, bless your heart, half the group is going to know what just happened and the other one is going to not. So that said, all the difference here is just how we have it. And by the way, in the US too, besides completely being right, that you're going to get areas more like this. Again, it does come from parent to child, but also with the US, what we tend to see is there's about 12 different regions in terms of when immigration happened and where they happened, that you kind of, that ultimately you'll see it within region. In India, there's actually going to be a little bit of you'll see in a sec what's happening in India. When I combine one other piece on this in just one sec, because it's actually an interesting piece with India, one in terms of where they are and the next thing we're going to talk about, but two in terms of how hierarchy will actually affect this. Okay. So this is the first piece of how we disagree. But the second piece is just how we express it, not just the words we use and whether we're comfortable, disagreeing directly, but also in how we express. So in emotional cultures, an individual's emotions are strongly reflected in their physical demeanor, stance, facial expression, movement, speech patterns, etc. Might surprise you to know that I'm a quarter Italian and I cannot talk with my hands still. These have to be moving. I have been known in one of these sessions before to just start walking back and forth and actually to walk off screen completely on mistake. So in emotional cultures, you're going to see a lot of emotion displayed. In non-expressive cultures, an individual's emotions are not strongly reflected in their physical demeanor. So you put these together. First, let me just show you on this side the emotionally expressive. So at the very top, we have the emotionally unexpressive all the way to the bottom where you have emotionally expressive. And this is the other part of the story of India. And I'm going to put them together and talk about different combinations in a second. And so what this says, especially for India, is that they don't necessarily like conflict, but they will be very emotionally expressive when it's happening. So we're going to talk about what are some of the ways to handle that. So if we put these together, what we end up finding is strictly on this disagreement, we actually have these 4 different kind of zones we need to look out for. And this should actually meet kind of what you're envisioning. So, or what you kind of know. So, and by the way, Abani, completely agree that Indian culture is not one culture, it's a culture of many cultures, absolutely. In the same way that the US has, many different subcultures. India has even more, and just as proof, look at the many languages that are out there. But that's absolutely right. But oftentimes, because it goes from parent to child, we will see these. But in any case, never start with, never just start with, oh, they are from insert country, it must be this way. Instead, start with, okay, could that help me explain this? If not, it could absolutely be that maybe they're from a certain country, but their parents are from somewhere else. Let me start trying to think through what cultural pieces they might have. And the key is when you're in that, you're in a very frontal cortex thing, trying to really get to what are they trying to tell me and not letting your emotions get in the way. So that being said, if we look at these four as kind of a broad high level piece, the first we see is emotionally expressive and confrontational. Think Italy. So this is one that's going to be lots of passion. There's going to be lots of yelling. There's going to be lots of very direct, that is wrong, but no one is actually taking offense. And so for you, if you're not from this cultural background, what's going to be the challenge for you is to not get offended. And the way to do that is to get that frontal cortex, is to start thinking, wait a minute, yes, all that means though is quick, translate in my brain. They're saying that's dumb, that makes no sense. Okay, for me, translate that into, oh, I respectfully disagree. And so you start having that. It's happening, but it's almost like, okay, this is just a family that loves each other, that's yelling and screaming. I shouldn't take offense. That doesn't mean you need to code switch and start yelling in a way that's not appropriate for you. It doesn't. Just kind of understand it. Yeah, Russia is going to be in the more this region. So the second region is confrontational and emotionally unexpressive. So this is going to be a country that a lot of people seem stoic and argumentative. In terms of the African cultures, by the way, I was actually thinking about this beforehand because some of these dimensions, unfortunately, for these specific dimensions, they had fewer studies in some of the countries in Africa. That said, where I would guess they would live is actually a little bit similar to India. There's some emotionally expressive, but direct confrontation isn't quite as strong as some other places. And then Latin America, we tend to see more top right. So that's where Brazil and Mexico are. We'll talk about in a second. That said, for confrontational emotional, basically everyone, not everyone, but the the kind of way to start thinking about it is stoic and argumentative. This is how they get to truth. And so some people will oftentimes say, Germans are really good at negotiating. Well, think about what we oftentimes say with negotiations. You don't want them to know what you're thinking, and you need to be willing to say no. Well, this is just culturally very comfortable for certain cultures. And so in that environment, you might be feeling this tension of having someone to say no to you. You might be feeling this tension of, they're just not showing you anything. But just remember, that is where they're culturally comfortable. So again, you translate that to your head of, okay, I would see that as, no, we're not quite there yet. That is just how they're bringing it to me. Still pretty straightforward. This is when it starts going really sideways, especially for a lot of people that grew up in America, especially say if you look at India. And this is the world now that you say, wait a minute, how can you start having a situation where you have very emotionally expressive cultural norms, but also you kind of avoid confrontation? And the answer is that there can be a lot of passion, but it can escalate fairly quickly. And so you as a leader have to ask yourself, how can you prevent that from happening? And so a few things that actually can be helpful. One is, for instance, leave the room if you're the boss. Actually say, let's go ahead and take a break. Let it act. Don't just let it keep building and building and building. Let it actually kind of separate. On top of that, if you can leave things anonymous, so in other words, getting people's opinions individually, and then being able to come together and says, look, it looks like overall, these are some of the pieces that we're thinking about. How do we want to attack that? It pulls out the part where people can actually take offense. A big one is to have the meeting before the meeting. If you get everyone in a room and the argument starts happening, well, then the emotionally expressive piece, but also wanting to avoid confrontation kicks in. If you talk to people one-on-one, you can now start understanding what's important to them, what they need. And the meeting itself is more of a synthesis of what you've already decided or what you've already gotten to through the individual meetings that themselves are not nearly as intense. Another thing for India, by the way, that is idiosyncratic, and we won't have time to talk about it today, is that you will see this emotionally expressive thing when people are at the same hierarchical level. When instead you actually see a difference in hierarchy, you will not see this happening, because another level that we won't talk about is power distance, and India is very high on power distance. that they're not going to walk into their bosses in general, their boss's office and start telling them what's wrong with the process. So you'll sometimes see at the same level these really, really emotionally expressive disagreements, but only when it's at the same level, much less so as opposed to the hierarchical piece. And yes, Avani, very much agree with you. Okay, so there is one other thing though to think about here is how you can help your constituents and anyone you're dealing with not get the emotional piece. And the answer is think about the words you're using. And so really simple words a lot of us don't even know we're using are upgraders versus downgraders. So upgraders are words preceding or following negative feedback that make it feel stronger, such as absolutely, totally, or strongly. For instance, this is absolutely inappropriate, this is totally unprofessional. That hits emotional cues with people. Downgraders do the opposite. These are words preceding or following negative feedback that soften the criticism, such as kind of, sort of, a little bit, maybe, or slightly. Alternatively, a sentence that describes a strong feeling the speaker experiences in terms that moderate the emotion. For instance, we're not quite there yet. This is just my opinion. In general, you are safe bringing in downgraders. You're safe softening it. Worst case scenarios, they didn't hear the message. They might not realize you need it as much as you do. You can always upgrade later. But if you start with an upgrader and you hit the emotional response, it's real, at that point, the limbic system has hijacked everything. Okay, so all of these will kind of help in this zone. In this zone, though, now we're avoiding confrontation and you're not having emotional expressiveness. That's where Americans tend to be. No idea how that works. I'm going to spend more time on that in the next one, on what we're actually talking about. To kind of close the loop, though, on disagreement, and this is why it's the easy one. In general, you're safe erring on the side of being non-confrontational. When dealing with a more confrontational individual, don't feel the need to change your way to start yelling and screaming at them, for instance, but don't take offense at the more direct disagreement. Just think to yourself, okay, they're probably more direct feedback. That's okay. I'm just going to translate it in my head. And then when dealing with a less confrontational individual, be as sensitive as possible. And remember, they're hearing you are wrong, not that you disagree with their opinion. So let me now get into the big one and the confusing one, the one that throws it. This is really the reason that most of the world views America as weirdly different. And you're going to see exactly where the weirdly different comes from when we look at some of the actual measures here. So next question for you, and this will be one where I ask for audience participation again in the chat window. You're in an offsite team lunch, and Shalini, who's one of your group members, starts making derogatory remarks about a specific group of coworkers in your department. Now, what do? Do you publicly speak up and condemn what she's doing? Or do you possibly condemn her, but not do it publicly? So go ahead and write public or not public in the chat window if you don't mind. All right, so we definitely have more not public on this, but we're definitely seeing some publics in here as well. This is interesting that this tends to be less of a split than we normally see. Normally you get about half and half. But a lot of you are kind of leaning towards not public. But I think you can start seeing how even that option, and speaking privately then would be the not public option. We can start seeing though that different people will have different pieces. And this starts getting into some of the next piece, which is much richer than just this one. So individualism pertains to societies in which the ties between individuals are loose. Everyone is expected to look after him or herself and his or her immediate family. Collectivism, which is most of the world by far, pertains to societies in which people from birth onward are integrated into strong, cohesive in-groups, which throughout people's lifetimes continue to protect them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. And this is the one that when I say America is weird, America is weird. So red is individualistic. Anything that's yellow or green can be yellow, green, or really green, which is most of the world, is collectivist. It's probably not surprising that most colonizing countries are more towards the individualism because their because of stronger institutions that were put into place to support the colonization, you tended to have people being able to rely on laws and police forces, where in the colonized areas, it was a lot more of, look, you had your family, so you better make sure that you're looking out for each other. I don't think there's been enough research around this, but it doesn't surprise me at all that this is what we see. But when I say America is weird, America is weird. So here's collectivist at 0, individualistic is 100. And that's not a subjective weird, it's just different than everyone else. So here is, so far, we've only gotten up to 38. Yeah, the gray areas are going to be just not enough data, that's right. This is just up to 38. So these are still all very collectivist countries. So let's keep going. And now we have a few that are at least past 50. All right, now let's get to the ones that are really out there, that are really much more individualistic. And coming in #1 is the US of A. So when I say we are different, we are very different. And what I want to be clear, when I said before, yes, these are at country levels, but ultimately it's at the individual level. I actually, we did this survey for a few MBA classes that I taught. Even within this class, and you think MBAs might be more individualistic. You think there might be this selection bias into people that would want that. Or on the flip side, you could think of it as a more collective bias because Fuqua, we actually pride ourselves on a more collective kind of ethos and how we teach. Even here, it's all the way from 40 to 100. This huge span where you have fundamentally different communication styles and cultural norms with these. And so I want to give you some insight into how they are and why, again, if you're thinking about India as kind of a focus right now, this alone, you're going to see a big difference. All right, so here's how the best way I've had to explain this. And I think what surprises people not from America is that Americans can actually do this. They just don't do it for very long. So I think the best way to think about this is guilt versus shame. So when you think about guilt, this is a very individualistic idea. Guilt is very inward focused. I did not do something well. I did not miss the mark. I did it wrong. Shame, by definition, has to exist within a group because it's the group itself that is putting the shame on. It's the group that you're shaming from. And you tend to have in individualistic societies, guilt's the predominant feeling, where in collectivists, it is shame. And so when I say that Americans can actually do this, here's when they do it. So imagine the last time you got a new job and you were on a new team. For that first week or two, what you probably did was you didn't speak out the whole time. You kind of stopped and read the room and saw who was saying what, when it's appropriate to say what, and whether they would want to hear what you're saying. And then if you're like most normal Americans, myself included, after about a week or two, you go, all right, that's good. And then you go back to, now I can just say what I want because now I'm in the group. Because that is exhausting. And unfortunately, anytime we are forcing people from a different culture to adapt to our culture, we are forcing that upon them. Another example is when you first start dating somebody. Remember those first dates, it's very reading the room of, okay, can I say that? Should I say that? Do I do that? It's exhausting, but it's doable. But then in US society, it tends to be, okay, good, now I can just be myself. When the rest of the world, no, kind of thinking about how everything you're doing affects the group is the default. And it's not anxiety inducing because that's the cultural norm. That's how you're raised. That's actually very comfortable. And so we have these systemic differences that we have seen between individualistic and collectivist societies. So first two are all about the basis for the employee relationships. And I'll just let you kind of read these. Second set are about how communication should happen. And then last is about more team-based or task-based focus. So one of the questions that Lyle asked is, how do we start, especially as leaders, do we start adapting to make sure that we're not hitting these cultural triggers? The first is to be aware of them and to recognize that it is the leader's responsibility to bend more. And outside of that, I'm actually going to give you some specific pointers when it comes to this in just one sec. That will help guide the way, and to some degree, recognizing that this is the short version. I would actually say Aaron Meyer's book will put more meat on it for you. But let's actually just quickly talk about why this is going to be so difficult when you switch to an organization that is more, in this case, individualistic than you are. So imagine you are more collectivist, and now you suddenly have individualistic employees. And it doesn't matter where you are on that map, as long as they're just more individualistic. So first off, it's going to be frustrating to have individualistic team members who are acting seemingly to you selfishly by putting their needs first rather than thinking of the team first. On top of that, you're relationship oriented, like you are building this team as a relationship rather than task oriented. So don't understand people that are breaking the relationship to accomplish tasks. And then you expect individuals to sacrifice their needs for the group, which can create conflicts with people that just seem more transactionally motivated. Flipping that, how is it difficult if you're individualistic? If any of you have moved overseas and suddenly had employees from a different culture, it can be hard to think of yourself as part of a unit or a unit at all, rather than as a collection of individuals. And actually thinking of this as group dynamics, not individual one-on-one relationships. You're task-oriented, and that's even how you do your performance measures, rather than relationship-oriented. You don't understand the prioritization you need to have over relationships. And then you think of sacrificing your own wants and needs for the group, rather than realize that it doesn't feel like sacrifice to a collectivist group. That's just more of the family ethos. So all of that, the real biggest difficult comes down to this. These are opposites. I mean, there's no way around it. These are opposites. And so the question for, especially a lot of people that grew up in the US, is how in the world can we communicate when these things are opposite? And the answer is you can, you just have to know what you're listening for. So first, consider this following conversation. So George, it looks like some of us are going to have to meet on Sunday to finish the presentation before Monday. I see. Can you make it to the meeting on Sunday? Yes, I think so. Great, that'd be a huge help. Yeah, Sunday's an important day. Oh, in what way? It's my daughter's birthday. Oh, how nice. I hope it's a great day. Thank you. Based on this, where is George going to be on his birthday? I'm going to be on Sunday. So in the chat window, really quick, to say what your first thought was. Was it going to be at work or with daughter? And don't overthink it, just whatever your first piece was. All right, so we definitely have more towards the daughter, but we definitely have work in there too. We have some both, which means we just had the exact same conversation, and 25% of you are expecting to see him at work, and others are not expecting, with the exact same language. And so the key here is when you're talking about collectivist societies, you have to understand that the nature of their communication is much more nuanced and much more high context. So in low context environments, and the US is one of the largest ones of these, good communication is precise, simple, explicit, and clear. Say what you mean what you say. Messages are understood at face value. Repetition is appreciated for purposes of clarification. One moment, please. There we go. As is putting messages in writing. In high context, however, high context cultures, communication is sophisticated, nuanced, and layered. Messages are often implied, but not plainly stated. Less is put in writing, more is left open to interpretation, and understanding may depend on reading between the lines. And here's the key in high context. In low context, I am talking to you on one channel, verbally or written, and I have it cranked to 11. In high context, I'm talking to you on 7 different channels. It might be it on 1 or 2 on each one, but there's 7. You just need to listen. I'm talking to you with my words. I'm also talking to you with the words I'm not using. I'm talking to you on how I'm moving, on whether I'm open or closed, on what my facial expressions are doing. All of these, you just have to listen. And this is where the onus is on you to be more uncomfortable recognizing I'm not going to know it and get it right all the time. But if I force them into a corner to say specifically something, I am causing all the anxiety to fall on them because for them, they're spoiling group harmony. So how do we do this? If you're a low context individual communicating with a high context individual, number one, listen more. Listen to what is meant. Reflect more, ask more clarifying questions, and be receptive to body language cues. Let me give you an example. Let's say a low context individual is talking to a high context, and the low individual says, can you have this done by next week? And the high context, maybe he sucks in his breath, maybe he says it'll be difficult, but I'll try my best. Maybe he says, we'll think about it. Maybe he says it'll be hard for these reasons, but let me consider it. They just said no. They said no loud and clear. You just didn't hear them. Here's what means yes, yes. Almost anything else says no. And by that, they can avoid the conflict, but still communicate to you that no, that can't happen, but you need to be listening and looking for it. And if it feels like it could be more exhausting, exactly. It is, it takes time. Eventually it gets more comfortable, but someone has to pay the price of the anxiety. And as you as the leader, as you the one that want the business, you as the one that is the colleague that are trying to nurturing your other colleagues, it might be you have to lean into that a little bit more. Number two, ask. So ask open-ended clarifying questions that avoid yes and no responses. So for instance, how difficult would it be for you to get away from the birthday party to come to work for a few hours? That allows them to give more information without just saying yes or no. On top of that, wait. Don't form opinions too early, listen more, speak less, then clarify if you're not sure if you understand. You might need to work through another local person to get the message deciphered. A huge, huge value is something called a cultural translator, which means somebody you trust that is native to the area, culturally native to the area, that you can actually ask, so look, I said this, they said that, I think they meant that, is that right or wrong? Once you have that, it makes it so much more beneficial because you're being vulnerable and saying, look, I'm going to try my best. I'm not going to always get it right. But you have someone that can kind of check you and that you can kind of see it, or the way I think I'm reading things, are they correct? So it minimizes some of your anxiety for a bit. So the more that you can find that and develop that, the better you'll be. On top of that, be patient. Don't assume that individuals are purposely omitting information or unable to communicate explicitly. Again, they might have felt like they have communicated in 12 different ways. You might have missed some of those that ultimately came out. Or it could be they just don't want to have the very direct no, and so they kind of drip out the information for you so that it avoids the harmony hit. Next, stop talking. If you said something once, stop talking. You can always come back to the topic if you're not sure if the message got through, but if you keep talking about it, it starts making them think that you don't trust them. It starts putting them into the corner of having to respond in a way that maybe is highly anxiety inducing for them. And lastly, it is perfectly fine, especially if you're new to an area, it's just admit defeat. Is if some context, put yourself down to get the information you need. For instance, I'm sorry, I think I confused myself. What was coming up? Were you gonna? And then, you know what, you're trying, but you don't always get it right. They respect the fact, anyone you're dealing with, they see you're trying to meet them where they are, they're absolutely going to respect that. Now, how do we go in the other direction? If you're high context, and now the onus is on you to communicate with low context. So if you're the leader in this position, you're going to have to force yourself to be direct, be as transparent, clear, and specific as possible. It's going to cause you anxiety, and this is the sacrifice of being a leader. It just is. You're going to have to lean into that. Eventually it becomes more comfortable, but at first you just need to. So for instance, if I am a low context talking to a high context, and if the low context says, you have this done by next week, you just need to say, I cannot have it done. I have it a week later, recognizing that yes, this is going to be anxiety inducing for you, but it's okay. It's just because of conditioning, and eventually it will ease up. On top of that, you need to assert your opinions transparently and clearly, again, recognizing that it's going to cause anxiety. So I think the timeline is too ambitious unless we bring in additional resources. They, especially if you're the leader, they might not hear you otherwise. So you might have to talk in ways that are more direct than you're comfortable with. On top of that, ask. If you haven't received 100% clarity, state clearly you don't understand and ask for clarity, which can be very difficult. Again, in terms of causing the anxiety to occur. And lastly, don't always be polite, because it can infer vagueness and uncertainty. So I know we're about out of time, and so I will leave you just kind of in things to think about based on what we have, is what scenario would you imagine is the most difficult to navigate when a low context is talking to a high context, low to a different low, high to low, or high to different high? So if you wanted to throw it in the chat just for fun, feel free. Low, high, low, different, high, low, or high, different. We have a high to low, a low to high. High to different high, low to high. So Avani, like many things in the chat that I've seen you come in, you were correct. Now any of these can be hard, but the thing with high to different high is each side is basically talking on 12 different channels. You know, what the body language is, what the cues are, how even nodding is happening, whether there's pauses. Well, if those 12 different channels are each speaking a different language, it can be really, really difficult to figure out how a common communication can even happen. At least with a very direct low context, it's just a recognizing of tone down the amplification on this one and start figuring out what's happening over here, as opposed to having to translate that one. So no, we're pretty much out of time, so I will end it there. Any questions? And I think a few might have popped into the Q&A, and I don't know whether I hit them in the chat or not. How does timidity compare to non-confrontational, and how does arrogance compare to confrontational? So when we are talking about timidity and non-confrontational, so timidity, I'm thinking of kind of in the big five, conflict avoidance. That's going to be a very similar thing. Arrogance and confrontational. I can't say that I know for sure of any research around this, but I would be surprised. I feel arrogance can actually cross any of these. You can be arrogant very directly. I am better than you. You can also be very arrogant in a high context environment, like, oh, your work is good. Yeah, which would have that piece. So my feel is that arrogance is going to be a little bit different. One thing I should actually, in particular, leave you with is none of these are good or bad. All they do mean is that you might have more anxiety in some types of roles or other. And it's up for you to make the decision, is that the sacrifice you want to make? Because you can be successful in anything, even if you have a different cultural background. It just might be more anxiety inducing for you. So with that, I believe I am done. We are out of time. Not sure if anyone's hopping in, but thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is great. Love your questions. Love it. My apologies, I wasn't able to get to more of them, but that was fantastic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Petrenka, for being with us. I know that everybody, it seems like, has enjoyed your presentation and has enjoyed participating. So thanks for being with us today. This is a great segue into possibly a series on India that we are aiming to do end of Q1, beginning of Q2. So if you're interested in that, everybody please sign up for our newsletter, and you'll get some information about that later on in the year. And we also have a webinar coming up in mid-February on STEP grant funds. So if you're interested in that, also keep an eye out for our newsletter to find out more information about how you can sign up. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.